Thank you. So I'll start out think about it. You've been on a long incident that's gone on all night and into the early morning, and it's 2 a.m. and another engineer is coming in to step in to take over. As soon as that engineer joins the call, what do? Do you check out, call it a night? 2, stay on and help the engineer come up to speed? Or 3, I don't know, I've never really considered this situation before. So we're going to look at that today and hopefully answer that question. So, hey everyone, I'm Todd. Today we're going to talk about handover communications and software operations, findings from the field. So a little bit about me. I've been in tech for 20 years, currently at CrowdStrike as S3 manager. A friend of mine told me I don't advertise my MBA, so I have an MBA, but my most recent accomplishment is with Human Factor System Safety at Lund University in 2022. So now before I get started, and by a show of hands, who's actually been a part of handovers or handoffs in the organization or past organizations and dealt with those situations? A lot of them. Thank you. So first, from the picture, this is kind of start of a journey. I kind of took pictures throughout my journey. So this is really as you can see, it's really neat and tidy for the most part. Computer's charged, I'm ready to go. It's kind of like, let's do this thing. So, but first we're gonna kind of define handovers as part of this. So it's a transfer and acceptance of responsibility achieved through effective communication. It is a real-time process of passing specific information from one person to another or from one team of persons to another for the purpose of ensuring the continuity and safety of work situations. And it's referenced there. So to get started, what's the history of handover communications a little bit? It's a brief. So late 1990s, NASA, the two individuals, you may see Dr. David Woods, but that's Dr. Emily Patterson. They were working together with NASA. The whole idea was to look into this about called in practitioners during high-stake, high-tempo situations. How fast can they come up to speed? So it's kind of the initiating thought around it. And then they got funded more grants. Further research came about for nuclear power generation plants, railroad dispatchers, ambulance dispatchers. And then as it went on, it grew in popularity. So healthcare is where, in my research, there was like 5,000 papers essentially just on healthcare around handover communications. And it's quite used regularly with nurses doing shift changes every 12 hours and things like that. 2022, after having some conversations with like Dr. Richard Cook and David Woods and Emily, it decided that I should go the route of software operations with handover communications. It's an untapped area of where this is actually being researched into. So there are really two different kinds of types of handover communications as part of the research. There's verbal, and that's pretty common. That's more in the office of what we've seen. And then digitally written, that evolved over time, and we'll kind of talk about that as we go on through the presentation. But it's really, we use a digital communications channel or platform like Slack or MS Teams, WhatsApp app, is what really the types of handover communications that occurred. So those are really the two types that came with the research. We never really, a bonus is a handwritten handover communications. Didn't really come about as the research went on, so it really is a reference here, but that's just a bonus of where we see that really early in healthcare and some other areas and other industries. So the area I looked at, handover communications and confidence and how they relate. So really it's investigating how engineers' confidence was with the information they gathered after the handover and how the exchange was. So we'll continue from there. So the first type of question we're going to answer is, what are the key attributes that contribute to how confident software engineers are with understanding the current state of the system after a handover and software operations is completed? So we did this in two different departmental backgrounds. Network Operations Center operates around the clock. There's on-call with it. It performs incident resolution and communications, both for internal and external applications. Pre-pandemic, they were verbal handovers in person. Pandemic current, if you want to call it post, I don't know if that's true right now, digitally written via Slack workflow. And we'll talk more about that evolution as we go into the themes part. So the other department was the customer support center. It operates around the clock. really resolves customer-facing questions and applications and problems. They did it was informal handovers initially, and then they evolved over doing a formal digitally written handovers via DMs at the time, and that's what they currently do today, based on the research. So there really is two methods of methodology. There's a methodology and methods that I use. So phenomenology, it's a big word, I know, but I'm going to kind of explain it. It's really illuminating lived experiences of people while they're doing their work, and looking and understanding how they do their work in each situation, in each individual situation. And then semi-structured interviews, that was really around, I conducted them, semi-structured interviews, and basically would tap individual engineers on the shoulder after I would informally observe a handover, and then go have a Zoom conversation with them with some semi-structured, matrixy type questionnaires, but then it was flexible enough to allow me to kind of weave in and out of those conversations to get more insights into their lived experiences and what was going on, and try to understand the environment that they're working in. So now we've covered the definition, the history, types, how handover communications and confidence relate, departmental backgrounds and methodology. We're going to do another quick peek, as you can see, into the journey as it's progressing. It's pretty messy at this point. This is probably how my brain's working at that point. And so I have more papers broken down through themes, and there's multiple books not pictured, but there's really a method to this madness, and we'll continue to explore. So now we're going to talk about the themes from the research. First, we're going to walk through those themes and see which ones emerged, and then kind of deep dive into those, and then at the end, we'll have a final conclusion around them. So the first one is organizational context of handover communications. There's really two sets to this. There is engineers' experiences with different types of handovers, and then reports of inconsistent communications. So really, if I go back to the original one, engineers' experience with different types of handovers, it really came down to engineers talking with them and what they experienced, and while the form that the organizational department wanted, it was really in digitally written form. They really preferred actual vocal conversations, and they were vocal learners. They wanted to have that touch point in a verbal perspective. And then the one around reports of inconsistent communications, really the engineers struggled with consistency from department to department around what information to communicate. It was kind of all over the place, and just thinking about that and putting yourself in their shoes around trying to figure out what department wants what information communicated to it from a handover perspective. It remained quite difficult and challenging for the engineers. So evolving handover communications was another theme. And this was around continuous improvement. So it really comes down to, well, we coined that term a lot in the industry. This really came down to, it wasn't really seen by them after we kind of produced this for them. And they essentially, what came down to it is the Network Operations Center, and what happened with them is they're originally verbal, then we had the pandemic hit, they went to an initial, basically a informal DM, informal Slack communication. Then we went to a complete, I'm going to write a whole blog post for my communications around the handoff. And that got to be where it was kind of lousy. And so then at that point, they moved to using a Slack workflow. And that's what they do today, is they perform a Slack workflow. They have a little bit of templatized information in there, and then that's how they actually communicate. And so there was a continuous improvement, and that is what the engineers within the Network Operations Center really enjoyed. That was one example. The other one was Customer Support Center, which they continually use the formal way of a DM today. So another one is information exchange. And what about that? So first one is coming up to speed. So how quickly are the engineers coming up to speed? I asked questions around that. It really came down to exchanging the information and what happened with this information, it was coming out of date quickly. So at that point, it would result in the engineering having to adapt, which is natural with adaptive capacity and things like that. As we know, those situations can be uncertain and unpredictable at times. The next one was verbose versus brevity. So verbose is really just the idea that it's really detailed information. How much information can I get? And then the other side is brevity, is just real quick snippets of information. And so from there, that really gave the engineers more, it depended on how satisfactory that information was, whether it gave them more confidence or not, around whether it was more detailed or real brief. And so that's around the information exchange. Preparedness for the handover. This one's, I think this will relate to everyone here. So balancing blended responsibilities with high workload demand. So a lot of that is engineers trying to prepare for the handover while they have, maybe they're managing 5 incidents. So they've got a project over here and they've got 3 other incidents going on. So preparing for that handover along with other responsibilities became difficult, and that was a lot of the insights we got from the interviewing. And so from that too, it actually added an extra layer of complexity. So then multitasking became not your friend. I know we all do it day to day, but we heard a lot of that in the insights from the engineers from the questions I asked. And then the next one is informal artifact gathering. So engineers at this point gather artifacts and notes throughout their day, but then they look to communicate that with the most up-to-date information that is available at the time. So those 2 areas is trying to prepare yourself for the handover and how it's going to give the incoming engineer the best information available at the time and being prepared for that. So guidance for handover communications. Of the guidance came formal handover templates. From the analysis, there were drawbacks and some benefits. And I know our hand templates and incident templates too are very relative as well. But so some of the drawbacks from that was they got into a point where it was a rubber stamp situation or check the box situation, and then they would just send the information off. But it didn't always have the most vital information. And the benefit was that is just having some basic areas of like, what's the impact? What's the common situations? Just some of that information for pre-text was beneficial as well. So it's kind of a catch-22 there, but for formal handover templates, that's what the engineer spoke to. And then limited processes and requirements. So really across the departments, there was minimal guidance. And then managers were able to just kind of create their own guidance for their own teams. There wasn't this just holistic guide that across all the departments that it would be nice for them to try to at least take some of that guidance and follow. It wasn't that way at all. It was just really just hit and miss across the departments and their teams. Sorry, yeah. Closing the loop. Now what's this about? Acknowledgement of the handover. So this really looked at asking questions about how engineers actually acknowledge the handover. Did they use a button? Did they DM it acknowledge? Did they use an emoji? That type of thing. And then that would help the engineers decide whether it was satisfactory or not, or unsatisfactory part of that. 2 is part of that as well. So acknowledging that information was key for engineers to feel like they got they at least from the outgoing, like it's been acknowledged, I can go home now and go do my thing. However, what comes next is, we heard, is availability after the handover. So not only do the engineers incoming want that they do the acknowledgement, but they would like availability after the handover from the outgoing engineer. And that may be essentially maintaining that availability after the handover by the outgoing engineer gave the incoming engineer the ability to ask questions and gain more context about the various situations that was just exchanged. A little history lesson along that. So NASA, when they did the research there, some of that information is the new operator would come in and they'd spend an hour with the old operator to really understand what was going on in the high tech, in the high risk technology situation within NASA. So that kind of I pulled from those strings as part of this research. So to recap, organizational context. So this is kind of the main themes. So organizational context of handover communications that came about, that emerged, evolving handover communications, information exchange, preparedness for handover, guidance for handover communications, and then closing the loop. So now that we know the themes that emerge, what did we learn as it relates to what can decrease or increase confidence after a handover? So we're going to put it all together. So what can decrease confidence? Inconsistency among departments of what information is needed. From the themes, it seems quite obvious, but actually putting it together, this inconsistency continued to be a main theme around this, and so that can actually decrease your confidence if you have inconsistencies. So if you look across your organizations today, are they consistent handovers? Are they how consistent are they? Do you need to look at more, do a post-mortem around that to figure out how you make them more consistent? No availability at the handover to ask questions or gain more context. So the question is do your engineers today actually stay later after your handover to at least 5 to 10 minutes, 15 minutes, whatever it be, to actually take on questions and give context to the incoming engineer? Or is it just they just bail out? That could decrease their confidence. Balancing responsibilities while preparing the handover may result in reduced information. So with that, it's this idea that you're, like I said, you're always trying to balance, and we're going through different scenarios and situations that it may hold true that you've actually reduced the information for the incoming engineer, and they feel like I'm unprepared even after the handover occurred. So keep that in mind of trying to balance that responsibilities, and are you giving the outgoing engineer enough time to actually balance getting the handover prepared and ready to go? Formal templates can lack vital information. I alluded to that in the themes too as well, but it really reigns true, because a lot of that happens is where the vital information just kind of goes on the way, and we don't get the information, so then the engineer's left after the outgoing engineer goes. What do I do? And then at that point, they essentially have to adapt to the situation. Further exploration for information right after the handover. So a lot of tales from that is engineers feeling like from the research that if they had to do further exploration added to their day from an incoming side, that they feel like, I don't have much confidence from that engineer's perspective, and maybe every time that engineer gives me information, it's not very vital information, so it just feels like that you're checking the box essentially. And so try to look for those areas where are they having to further explore constantly, or is it more just a onesie-twosie type thing? So it's something you could essentially course correct. So the most important, what people love, is what can actually increase confidence for engineers with handover communications. So verbal handovers need to be in support of digital written handovers. So the idea there is to do the digital written and then actually jump on a Zoom call if you're remote. If you're in office, obviously you can just do the verbal and that'll be fine, but digital can help that as well. But really trying to support both is really ideal in this situation. Detailed handovers, whether verbal or digitally written, are of the utmost importance. So with that, digital handovers, as much detail as you can get up to the point where you can hand it over. And that may be 30 minutes before, just so it gives more time for the engineer to ask questions before your actual shift is over. Creating an embedded workflow or process for the handover can help reduce context switching. So with that, they're trying to balance responsibilities multiple different ways. So what if you created more of an embedded workflow? If you're a heavy Slack usage company, then you might have an embedded workflow there. You might do it for Microsoft Teams. The added context switching of, I've got to go update a Google Doc. I've got to go update Word. I've got to go update a wiki page or something like that. There could be more things missed potentially. And so actually embedded that workflow into that process for the handover will actually help, from what we've seen, increase confidence and less context switching. Guidance about what information to supply for each handover needs to be consistent. Again, this is all about consistency across departments. And I think this is an area where we have to understand how the work's getting done, rather than imagining and updating guides that way, versus just imagining what we're doing and then trying to put that out as a guide. So it's really key to understand and supplying what information folks need in order to do a successful handover, and it makes the engineers feel like they have confidence in those handovers and being consistent across the departments. Acknowledging the handover is a must. So there's a story around this from one of the conversations I had with an engineer around acknowledging the handover. An outgoing engineer wrote their handover, submitted it in the Slack workflow, and then the incoming engineer didn't acknowledge it. And it's literally the outgoing engineer's just waiting, poking. It was minutes, hours. And so really acknowledging the handover is a must, and then also having that availability too as part of that. So final thoughts. It seems reasonable for organizations or other industries to test these key findings in the future. And I'm sure there's more that part of my research didn't capture that more could capture from it, considering this is an area that's quite scarce within software operations. These key findings may help provide increased confidence for engineers after a handover. So where did we land? Okay. The journey concludes. Is it a little flaky? Yeah. Okay. So there we go. Okay. So this is June 2022. Sometimes you hear folks, if you're in the LFI, they talk about Smokes and Johan. Well, here they are. Smokes is on your left and Johan is on your right. They run the program at Lund. So quick bits. So follow Lund HFS on Twitter. There's usually some good information out there. They provide books. They just kind of tweet different things out. They also provide thesis for your weekend type stuff and things like that. So I encourage you to kind of follow that on Twitter. They haven't been moved over to Mastodon or anything like that right now. And then there's my thesis link. There's more to it. Some areas, given the time, there's some areas around the frameworks and things like that that maybe in a future talk I'll be able to get to. But other than that, as for questions, I'd stay to answer them, or you can chat with me at lunch or whatever. But thank you.